Good morning, everyone. So I was going to congratulate all of those who are fathers here today. It's a great privilege and a great responsibility to be a father. For many years, I have carried the title of pastor. But one of the titles I enjoy the most is that of dad. I'm fortunate to have a great relationship with all three of my sons who live very close to me. And as good as it is to be called a dad, it's even better to be called grandpa. So today I miss being home and getting 4 hugs from each of my grandchildren. So in fact, I would remind all the children who are listening today that since today is Father's Day, you do something extra special for Father. I know they do special things for you all the time, but this is your day to return the favor. Because of my job with Live Global, I get to do a little bit of travel in various countries. And obviously we find things that are different in people from each country. But I also find that there are many things that we carry in common. I'm not going to give you a whole list of those kind of things, but I will mention one. Many of us enjoy watching a movie once in a while. My wife enjoys watching movies that have romance involved. Whereas I enjoy watching movies that have more adventure to them. Before I left home to come on this trip, I had a chance to watch a particular movie. The name of the movie is American Underdog. American Underdog. Sounds like that's not a word that's common here. Okay. So I'll explain the word in the title of the movie in just a moment. But this movie turned out to be about sports. And it focused on a particular sport that's played in America called football. Now, this is not soccer like is played in many countries. This is the kind of game where someone throws a ball, someone catches the ball, and then a lot of guys try to knock that guy down. Now, in this particular movie, it was about a man named Kurt Warner. Now, his name to you is not necessarily important, but he played in the game of football. In fact, he played one of the most important jobs in the football team. It was his job to decide what kind of plays to make and when to throw the ball. But this movie was all about his life. And it turned out that he wanted to be a football player from the time he was very young. His goal was to play in a famous football team. But for years, no one thought he was good enough to play. He finally ended up taking a job in a grocery store just to pay his bills. But then one day, a famous team came and asked him to join their team. And they put him in the job of being that most important player. And throughout that entire season, his team began winning more and more games. So that by the end of the season, they decided that he was the most valuable player. And they even gave him a special award for that. And then, because his team had played so well all year long, they played in the most important football game of all, called the Super Bowl. And it turned out they won that game as well. And then they decided that he was the most valuable player in that game as well. Now in America, there are two phrases you may not be familiar with. One phrase is someone is called the top dog. If you are called the top dog, it means you are like the boss or the most important person. Like maybe you would call pastor here the top dog of your church. But there's also another phrase called the underdog. An underdog is someone that no one thinks can really do a good job. They don't put any of their hopes on that person. They don't think they will ever really accomplish much of anything. And that's why the title of this movie was called American Underdog. Because no one thought this particular man would be able to do such a great job in playing football. Now you may be wondering what all this has to do with the Bible. I think in some ways it's a great illustration for all of us. When we read through the Bible, we hear the stories of many important men and women. We read about Noah, who builds the ark and saves people. We read about Moses, who leads the people through the wilderness and splits the sea. We read about David, who faces the giant Goliath and has victory over him. And all of these are very inspiring stories for us. But sometimes here's the problem I have when I read those stories. I think I will never be able to be I've never had animals line up to have me save them. I've never been able to get water to stand up straight. And when I face men who are bigger than me, I usually run away afraid. And so sometimes I think God can use all of those great men, but could He use me as well? And then I start to realize that the Bible is filled with other kinds of men. The kind of men that we could describe as underdogs. These are men that no one thinks is going to be really important. They have no great plans or hopes for these guys. But the Bible is filled with men and women that God uses. And for many of them, you will never even know their name. But today, I want to take you to one man who could be described as an underdog. You may be familiar with his name. His name is Andrew. You find him in the New Testament. He is one of the early disciples of Jesus Christ. Let me tell you just a little bit about Andrew. His name, Andrew, means manly. So by his very name, the image you would have of him is a strong man. His job was that of a fisherman. And in a time of Andrew, to be a fisherman, you had to be strong. Andrew was also a disciple of John the Baptist. That would imply to us that he already had a heart for God. He wanted to see what God was doing in his time and world. But in many ways, Andrew was just an ordinary man. Probably not much different from you and me. In fact, after Acts chapter 1, his name is never mentioned again. Tradition would tell us that after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Andrew began preaching. They tell us he preached in Greece, and maybe went as far north as Ukraine, and finally preached in what is now southern Russia. Now you may remember that Peter, when he was toward the end of his life, when he was crucified, he did not want to be crucified like Jesus. And so he asked that they crucify him upside down. We also learned that Andrew had that same idea. When he was finally arrested and crucified, he did not want to be crucified like Jesus. And so they crucified him on a cross in the shape of a big X. And now sometimes today you'll see an X on a flag. And that is usually referred to now as the Andrew cross. So there's not a lot said about Andrew in the Bible. But what we do read about him, we learn about his heart. And so today we don't want to talk so much about his accomplishments as we want to talk about his heart. Because for you and me today, our accomplishments are not as important as our heart toward God. If you have a Bible with you this morning, we'll turn to the Gospel of John. And we're going to approach our study this morning a little bit differently, maybe. I'm going to ask Pastor to read for us some passages from John. We're going to read about 3 different times where the Bible talks about Andrew. And as we read these, and as you read along and listen, I want you to watch what's being said about Andrew and what he does. The first passage is in John chapter 1.
John chapter 1.
Yes. And we're going to start in verse 35. And I'll ask Pastor to read through verse 42. Now, I want you to just keep in mind all of what we've just read about Andrew. I want you to go to a second passage. Still reading in the Gospel of John. Go to chapter 6. And we'll start in verse 1 and read down through verse 9.
Minsan, so saya Pilipino may tamli siya.
Now keep all of that in mind, and we go to one more passage. Still in the Gospel of John, chapter 12. And now look at verses 20 through 22. Now let me Okay. So let me share with you three things that we can learn from the life of Andrew. First of all, we learned that Andrew knew the value of individual people. You remember in that first passage that we read in John chapter 1? Andrew had been a follower of John the Baptist. But when Jesus comes along, John tells Andrew to follow Jesus. And when Andrew follows Jesus, he becomes convinced that he is the Messiah. And you remember the very first thing that he did? He went to tell one person about that. And that one person was his brother, Simon, later called Peter. And then you remember in the second story, in John 6, there's this time we call the feeding of the 5,000. And no one has food for them all. And all the disciples are confused and don't know what to do. And Andrew finds one boy and brings him to Jesus with his lunch. And then finally, in that last passage in John chapter 12, I find this passage very interesting. There are some men who want to meet Jesus. And so they go to Philip to find out how they could meet Jesus. But did you notice what Philip does? Philip goes to Andrew and asks for his help. Because Andrew already has the reputation for taking individuals to Jesus. See, when we read through the Gospels and then through the book of Acts, we find that Andrew and his brother Peter had opposite methods of approaching people. Peter was often drawing crowds of people to Jesus. Andrew was bringing individuals to Jesus. Now think about how we view ourselves today. We usually have value for people who can speak to crowds.
Mga mo miti aza simo mo sangla sinte mai sana khatsi nei jenge.
We tend to think those people who are really doing a work for God can speak to big groups of people.
Jana paden tong di te chu ai ni tak ta la thuyen nei de da ni ko.
But do you know what we learned from Andrew?
Ama ba ndu ba mai ji.
There is great value in taking individual people to meet Jesus.
Tam ta mi se lo mi mang ko ma se su pui la so shi man pha da mai ji se le.
In fact, if you were to study the life of every great evangelist, those men who can speak to hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, and if you go back in the story of their life, somewhere along the way, there has been one individual person who introduced them to Jesus. This example of Andrew is a great encouragement to me. I have never spoken to crowds of thousands of people. And I don't know that I ever will. But can God use me, an ordinary person, someone who maybe other people think will never do anything amazing? I think God can use me. And even more amazing is this. I think God can use you. When you recognize the value of bringing individual people to Jesus. So Andrew knew the value of individual people. Andrew also knew the value of quiet service. The value of doing those simple things that sometimes very few people even notice. You realize that in the Bible, Andrew is not mentioned nearly as often as Peter, James, and John. Now, he could have been more visible. People could have talked about him more often. After all, he was one of the very first disciples chosen by Jesus. But Andrew was content to work quietly. Oftentimes in the shadow of other people, including his brother Peter. Andrew must have known what it would be like when he asked Peter to come and meet Jesus. Having been brothers all their life, Andrew knew what Peter was like. He knew that Peter was very outgoing. He knew that Peter was probably the kind of guy that made friends very easily. He knew that Peter was the kind of guy that everybody wanted to invite to their parties. In fact, every time we see the list of the disciples in the New Testament, do you know whose name is almost always first? It's that of Peter. And so Peter is someone who is always taking the lead. Think about all these stories in the Gospels. The night when they're all in the ship and the storm comes up, and they see Jesus walking across the water. Who's the one that steps out into the water? It's Peter. Do you remember when Jesus is about to be arrested? And the soldiers are coming there in the garden. Who's the one that steps up and draws his sword? Who's the one that says, I'm going to rescue Jesus in this situation? It was Peter. Do you remember when Jesus says, I'm going to go and be arrested and face a trial? There was one disciple who said this: no matter what happens, I will never leave you. Who was that would make such a bold statement? It was Peter once again. In the book of Acts, who's the one that preaches to a crowd and 3,000 people respond to Jesus for salvation? It's Peter doing these large things. We find that Peter, in fact, writes 2 of our New Testament books of the Bible. Do you know that Peter's name is mentioned 153 times in the New Testament? Andrew's name comes up 12 times. Peter was an extraordinary man. Andrew was an ordinary man. In many ways, he lived under the shadow of his brother Peter. We tend to remember the Peters in our world, but we forget about those who are like Andrew. But here's the thing to remember. While those people who are kind of like Peter, who can speak to big groups and do what seems to be amazing things, it's the quiet people who often do something significant for God. So Andrew knew the value of individual people. Andrew knew the value of quiet service. We also find that Andrew knew the value of small gifts. Once again, you remember the story about the feeding of the 5,000? All of these people here who are hungry while they're listening to Jesus. The disciples had no idea what to do. They thought it would cost them a year's worth of money to feed all these people. But it's Andrew who sees a boy with just a small lunch. And he brings that small lunch to Jesus. You know, I would not be surprised, but what other disciples saw that same boy. And they may have seen that small lunch that he had carried with him. But they probably thought to themselves, that's too small. That has no value to what's But it was Andrew who saw the value of something small in that way. See, nothing is small in the hand of God. So many times we look at ourselves and think of ourselves as small. We look at all the resources that we may have as individuals and think they're just small. But it's not the size of the gift, it's the power of God. And instead of us stepping back when there is an opportunity to give, what if we were to just be willing to step forward with what small gifts we have? See, it's not always just the money when we think about giving gifts. I've already been told that you as a church are very generous. And that is a great testimony to you. But sometimes we think of small things that we can give as though they have very little importance. I'm not going to turn to this passage, but let me remind you of another story. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus is with his disciples. And they're at the temple watching men and women come with their gifts. And of course the Pharisees are bringing lots of coins. And they throw them in the container that make lots of noise. Because they want to get lots of attention from people. But you remember how Jesus watches one widow lady come? And she puts in 2 small coins. And Jesus tells his disciples, look at what just happened. And he tells them, she just gave more than all the others. Was it more money? No, of course not. Were they special coins that were of greater value than others? No, it was not. She saw what her heart was doing. See, when you give either of money or other resources, it's not so important how much you give as what's going on in your heart. And don't limit yourself in any way to what you can give back to God. In fact, I would have you go out this morning with this question in mind. What can I give? As an ordinary man or woman, what can I give? Let me take you to another quick story, also in Mark. The disciples are walking along with Jesus. And they're having this argument among themselves. And they're trying to decide who's the most important of all the disciples. And you can kind of hear them making their argument for each other. And one is saying, no, I'm more important than you. And someone else is saying, no, I'm the most important of all of you. And then Jesus quiets down the conversation. And he says to them, whoever wants to be first must be last. And they must be willing to be servant of all. You know what I learned from the example of Andrew? He was never trying to push his way to the front. He was never trying to say to everybody, hey, look at me. He was never trying to get the attention of people around him. He was willing to be involved in quiet service. Here's the question I would throw to you. Where can I serve? You know, I have been working in churches almost all of my life. And I've known many people who do the things up in front of everyone else. Maybe they speak to the group from the Word of God. Maybe they sing in front of others. And all of those are good. But the people I find that I respect the most, who do the quiet little things that almost no one notices. In fact, I can think of one of the churches where I was a pastor. And there was a man there in the church who had more money than probably everyone in the church combined. He was a very wealthy individual. But if you were to come to our church on a Sunday morning, before almost anyone else was there, you would see that man there. And what would happen at this particular church is we would have flocks of birds that would come around sometimes. And they were big birds. And they would leave a certain kind of big pile behind them. Like all birds do. But on a Sunday morning, before anyone else was there, the man who had more money than anyone else would come and clean the sidewalk. Willing to do quiet service for God. Where can you and I serve? And one last question. In Luke, Jesus tells another story about a shepherd who was gathering his sheep in the evening. And he was bringing all of his sheep into the fold. And just like he does every night, he starts to count them. And he knows he's supposed to have 100 sheep. But he counts up to 99 and has to stop. Because one sheep is missing. And does he do what I would have done? I would have said, well, at least I've got most of them. And I probably would have closed the gate and gone to sleep. But no, that shepherd went to look for the one that was lost. Andrew was somebody who knew the value of individual people. Do you and I know the value of individual people? Do we care about those who do not yet know about Jesus? It's this simple question. Who do I know? Who do I know out there in my circle of friendships that is yet to put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ? Many times over the years when I was a pastor,
Pastor ko man lai kung tanda may chichir bay.
I would come to our church just like this,
Yang may simak kung paano siya.
and I would say, today we're going to write some names down.
Tuwing may bangsa ko yan kilichin.
And I would ask everyone to take out a piece of paper
Kasi mission aminu yan kilin na ko yan.
and get a pen or a pencil,
Paper like kaya mo pensyon na yan.
and I would ask them to make what I was calling my blessing list.
Kasi kaya di ma walso na katan de chikyal din kagena.
And I would ask them to make a list of 5 names.
Ni min na ang walso na chikyal.
The names of 5 people that they knew who, to the best of their knowledge, were not Christians.
Kasi take to na tong de Christian de.
And then I would ask them to start praying for those 5 people
Huminga te ada tug sa tingin kagena.
and ask God to bless them.
Pagkina mo te walso tingin kagena.
And then I would say, why don't you go and start talking to those 5 people?
Ay le hu cha bang nga te ko ma thu kagena tingin. O tingin kagena.
And simply say this,
Isin sila kita.
I would like to be praying for you.
Nang ating ham de sa to.
I would like to pray that God would bless your life.
Pagkina mo walso to.
How could I best pray for you?
Nang ating bang siya tong ham de sa tingin.
And do you know what happens when you start to do that?
Kasi mga ano ta siya bang tungay le.
People start to realize you care about them.
Minite na ma hui dum siya le or mo nei chang ti.
And then they wonder, why do you care about me?
Pagkina bang siya tingin ta ang phone ang nei chang ni di ba?
And it gives you the opportunity to tell them why.
Pagkina Asia na yan din mo yung sa man video.
Because of all that Jesus Christ has done for you.
Kasi bang manang siya nang siya din mo kung siya nei chang ni.
Here's what I hope you will walk away and remember today.
Kasi tuwing hindi ta ang siya may no get up din kang di.
The Bible is filled with stories of amazing men and women.
Bible pe mi kan ta tan siya may pasal ading.
People that God used in large events.
Pagkinin lopi ta may avan ta sa loyo ma.
But the Bible is also filled with the stories of ordinary people.
Isang avan tang waya mga mo hong cha sita sa loyo pi.
People just like you and me.
Kasi mi de sa nakita bang de sa pi.
And I hope you will come away asking God how He could use you.
Kasi tuwing pagkin bang jing sang le chi no de chi.
And then start every day with this kind of thought. God, what do you want to do with me today? And then with a sense of eager anticipation, look for the ways God can use you. What you can give, where you can serve, and who you can know. And let me just pray for you. Our great Heavenly Father, we thank you most of all for what Jesus Christ has done for us. Apart from the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection, we would have no hope of a relationship with you as our eternal God. Words of appreciation can never match what you have done. But now you give each one of us this privilege to be a representative for you in the world in which you have placed us. And I would ask that you would take all of us who are just ordinary people, and use us this week to bring glory to you. And we look forward to what you're going to do. In Jesus' name, amen.